Welcome back to part 2 of this episode on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. If you haven't seen part 1, I'd go watch that first. But here in part 2, we continue the discussion with Don Blackwell, Kerry Duke, Dave Miller, and myself. Thanks for watching.
If a man and a woman find out that they are in an unscriptural marriage, must they divorce and separate in order to be pleasing to God, or can they remain together? That's what we're going to talk about on this episode of Answering the Error. Hi, I'm Don Blackwell, and I am the host of Answering the Error. This is Aaron Gallagher. He is the co-host of Answering the Error, and we've been doing this program for several years, but we're going to do something that's a little bit different today, and that is we have some guests with us. And so I want to begin and introduce you to our guest host today. First, we have Dr. Dave Miller. Dave is with Apologetics Press. Dave has a PhD. Dave has been preaching for many years. He has written a number of books, and he also is a man that we have great respect for, and we're very honored to have you with us on the program today, Dave.
Thank you, Don. Very kind.
We also have Dr. Kerry Duke, and Kerry is also a man we hold in very high esteem. Kerry has written a number of books. He has worked for years with Tennessee Bible College, and we believe he's particularly qualified for the program we're going to be discussing today, and that is the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, because Tennessee Bible College was kind of at the forefront of this battle for many years.
Right.
And so Kerry is a great one to have, and Kerry, we're glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Don.
Let's do the fourth argument, Aaron.
All right, fourth reason. I don't believe that Jesus' teaching shows that those who divorce and remarriage, contrary to Matthew 19, verse 9, are living in this ongoing state of adultery. It's because of the overall context. Remember, the Pharisees come to Jesus and they try to get Jesus into this debate that they're having over the cause of divorce in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4. They ask him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? And they mean, is it lawful according to Moses' law? And so in Deuteronomy 24, you remember, Moses says that, if a man marries a woman and she finds no favor in his eyes because he finds in her some uncleanness. Now, what is that some uncleanness? Well, it's an ambiguous phrase. And it seems to me that it's got to be something less than the woman's adultery, because 2 chapters earlier in Deuteronomy 22, verse 22, Moses legislates that if the woman commits adultery, the penalty is not divorce, the penalty is her execution. And so if the penalty for divorce is execution, what's the reason for Deuteronomy 24? So the some uncleanness has to be a reason less than the woman's adultery. So if a husband divorces his wife for a reason less than her adultery, some uncleanness, and if she then goes out and marries a second husband, and that second husband divorces her, or that second husband dies, Moses says the first husband cannot remarry her. And that's the point of the legislation here in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4. It's to say that first husband cannot remarry his wife after he's divorced her, and she marries a second husband, and that marriage ends for some reason. Now, why can the first husband not remarry his wife under those circumstances? Well, it says, after she has been defiled. Now, what does it mean the woman was defiled, and for that reason the husband cannot remarry this wife that he divorced? When was she defiled? Well, it seems that the defilement, to me, it just makes sense. The defilement took place in her second marriage. I agree with the explanation given by Kyle and Delitzsch in their commentary. You might check that out to see this position. I think that what Moses is teaching in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4 is what Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. The woman became defiled in that remarriage. In fact, in the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, made around 250 to 150 BC in Alexandria, Egypt. In that translation, the form is very similar to what Jesus says in Matthew 5, verse 32. In the Septuagint, whenever it says after she has been defiled, it's meta ta min thenai autain, after she has been defiled, right? So you've got this aorist passive infinitive, min thenai. And remember in Matthew 5:32, Jesus says that whenever the husband divorces his wife, saving for the cause of sexual immorality, he makes her to commit adultery, poi autain, moikuthenai. So again, you get this aorist infinitive. So the form is very similar. So I think that Moses and Jesus are saying the same thing. So this husband, after he divorces his wife for a reason less than her sexual immorality, when she goes out and marries a second husband, she becomes defiled. But what's forbidden is not that second marriage. What's forbidden is for the first husband, after her second marriage ends, to remarry her. That's what's forbidden. Now, if God wanted to forbid the second marriage of the wife who's divorced for a reason less serious than her sexual immorality, he could have inspired Moses to do that. If God wanted wanted that second marriage of the woman to end, he could have inspired Moses to command a woman in such a situation to get out of her second marriage, but he doesn't. What he forbids is for that first husband, after he divorces his wife and she goes out and marries another man, from marrying her a second time. That's what would cause the land to be defiled. And so, in light of the fact that Jesus is commenting on that question the Pharisees asked concerning this debate on Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 to 4, it doesn't seem to me that Jesus is teaching that remarriage constitutes an ongoing state of adultery.
Okay, so in this clip, Mike goes back to Deuteronomy 24. He believes that Deuteronomy 24 is what Matthew 19 is addressing. And then he goes to basically draw a parallel from the grammar. He says in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 4, in the LXX, which is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. He says when you look at the Greek from Deuteronomy 24 and the Greek from Matthew 5:32, they have a similar form. Deuteronomy 24:4 is defiled aorist passive infinitive, and Matthew 5:32, commit adultery, aorist passive infinitive. And the point he's making is, hey, these two are sort of parallel passages. And in Deuteronomy 24:4, yes, there was sin, she was defiled, but she didn't have to leave that second marriage. That seems to me to be the argument that he's making. What's your take on that?
Well, I was going to go back and summarize these points very quickly,
Great.
And then we're going to toss it to our guest to answer this. The four arguments that Mike makes: number one, Matthew 19:9 commits adultery. He says is present indicative, and so it doesn't mean continuous action. Number two, he argues that moikatai in Matthew 19:9 is parallel to Matthew 5:32. Number three, if Jesus wanted to communicate that it was ongoing, he would have used a different word. And then the fourth argument, he says that Matthew 19:9 overall matches the context of Deuteronomy 24, just trying to keep it in the scheme of things. So how would you, brothers, respond to this?
Well, go back to Matthew 19 and look how it develops. They ask him a question. Here's the whole point of chapter 19 as far as the discussion with these Jews. Can we divorce our wives for any reason? Come on, give us the answer. Well, Jesus didn't go to Deuteronomy 24. Mm-hmm. He went to Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 2:24. There's your answer. I happen to think that he was then going to give the one exception to that, which has always been in effect, but they interrupted him. Well, then why did Moses tell us we could divorce our wives, or what, command us to do so? Well, if that was the proper answer to their original question, I'm sure he would have brought that up, but he didn't, and then he proceeds to explain why he didn't bring it up. That's a commentary on the hard hearts, which, by the way, they had too, in attacking Jesus the way they did. And then he comes back with that to make sure they don't miss it. From the beginning, it was not so. I've given you the answer that you asked for, why you can't divorce for any and every reason. As a matter of fact, there's only one, and that's been in effect for all of human history. It's the same reason God himself gave for divorcing Israel. It's the one and only reason. So I'm a little bit surprised that Deuteronomy 24 is even occupying a discussion here about how we're to sort out divorce and remarriage for any period of history, because that's not the prototypical passage to go to.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
Kerry, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with that. Just one simple point about it, and that is in Deuteronomy 24, verse 4, Moses didn't say anything about, he didn't use the word remarry the former spouse. What he said was, he shall not take her again to be his wife. Now, I know that's marriage. I know that's a remarriage. I'm just saying that word is not specifically used. The way that it's worded is, he may not take her again to be his wife. Now, the speaker on this video is making the big point throughout this whole thing that it's not having that relationship. It's not being in that marital relationship. It's getting married.
Right.
That goes out the window with this.
Yeah. Because this implies it would be ongoing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're
It's-
saying he's saying that it's wrong to get married, but then you can repent of that and continue in the marriage. And you're saying Deuteronomy 24:4 must not take her back to be his wife.
Be his wife.
Not must not take her back to marry her.
Right.
Must not take her back to commit the act the initial time, but she can't be his wife.
Yeah.
It's
It
incidental.
seems like that'd be durative.
Right. It's incidental to the overall point of Deuteronomy 24, but it's really on the point with what he's trying to argue in this video, I think.
Yeah. I want to change gears here for just a minute, unless y'all have something more to offer. I'm a very simple-minded guy, and we have dealt with some complex things here. As I said, I believe a lot of these language arguments are smokescreens. I want to state Mike's position, and I want to go through it as I have summarized it, and I'd like to hear your comments on it. Mike's position is, if a man divorces his wife not for fornication and he gets married again, that act is adultery. He can then say, I'm sorry, and repent and stay in that marriage, and all is good. That's his position, stated very simply. In order to get to Mike's position, first he determines that moikatai is gnomic and punctiliar. And so he says, it's not ongoing according to the text. He says it is a one-time act. In order to reach that conclusion, you've got to find something in the grammar, or you've got to find something in the context. There's nothing in the grammar that would indicate this. So what does the context say? The context is king here. Does the context indicate that this is a one-time act? And I would argue that it does not. The immediate context in Matthew chapter 19 would indicate the opposite, because in Matthew 19 and verse 10, when Jesus' disciples heard what Jesus said, that is, if a man divorces his wife except it be for fornication and marries another, he commits adultery. They are shocked by this. They think this is very strict. And so they said, Lord, if that's the case, it's better not to get married. Would that not indicate to you that that doesn't match up with Mike's view? Mike's view is you can just simply say you're sorry and you go forward.
That's right.
Okay. Any thoughts
I
about
just remember hearing Denny Petrillo once say, if what you teach, he talked about being brought into some elderships that were divided, and he asked each group, is what you teach on Matthew 19:9, would it elicit the same response from the disciples? Wow, that is such a strict teaching, it's better not to remarry. And in one situation, he said half the eldership said, our view would not elicit that. And that eldership, I believe, said we're teaching the wrong thing. And so, one of the responses to this is if you say, well, Matthew 19:10, if your position doesn't elicit the response in the disciples say, wow, that's tough, it's better not to remarry. One of the responses that was made in the video addressing us that caused this is, he said, well, that argument is also used by people who are further to the, to which direction. They're stricter than you, because some groups say there's no exception, not even fornication. And all I would respond to that is, well, that would only prove that either our position or the more strict position is correct. The idea that a position that says, well, you can marry, it's a little bit, it's sinful, but you have to say you're sorry and keep the wife, that does not seem to me that would elicit the reaction, wow, so wait, if we divorce our wife unscripturally and marry another, we have to repent, but we get to keep the wife? If that's the case, we shouldn't marry. That just doesn't logically make sense to me.
So my first position is He argues from the grammar, which I say is a lot of smoke, because what it comes down to, I don't mean that disrespectfully, it's just blurring the issue. What it comes down to is context is going to answer this for us. The immediate context says his position is wrong because the disciples responded and they believed this was very rigid, which does not match his position. Secondly, I would argue that the greater context of the Bible, what it says about marriage, indicates that he's wrong. Now, first, I would go to Romans chapter 7 and verse 3. We learn some things about God's law for marriage. This is what it says. So then, if while her husband lives, she marries another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man. If a woman marries another man, she is committing adultery. That is ongoing adultery. It's not a one-time sin and it's over, but the indication of the Bible is the adultery is something that she is continuing in, which that contradicts his position about marriage and divorce. Any comments about that one?
Yeah, and of course in Romans 7, he's using marriage as an analogy to how you cannot be married to Christ and still hold to the law of Moses. So he says, look, you're an adulteress if you try to keep the law of Moses and following Christ. And so, of course, the context, that's why the exception from Matthew 19 is not in here. But you're right, what he's saying is it's not just the initial act. It is you are continuously in an adulterous relationship, and of course, we'll get to what the adultery is,
It wasn't just the divorce and the remarriage. She divorced her husband and she remarried another man. Mike's position would be at that point she'd sinned, but she could continue in that marriage and she's not an adulteress. That is exactly the opposite of what Romans 7 says. Romans 7:3 says she continues as an adulteress.
Yeah, and that point.
Kerry, you look like you're thinking hard.
Oh, I was just looking up the tense on that. That's a present active infinitive,
Okay.
which he says is ongoing.
Okay. All right.
Throughout the New Testament, you have 2 or 3 different words used, translated live, walk, like walk in the light, and over and over and over. I mean, letter after letter, book after book. It's clear that Paul and John and Peter are talking about your conduct on a daily basis. And the kinds of things that they mention are punctiliar sins, if you want to say that, like telling a lie or stealing. And yet in Colossians 3, and he mentions, among others, fornication, adultery. And he says, now, back there when you were not Christians, you were living in that. Well, what did he mean? Like the alcoholic had a glass of alcohol to his mouth, and the whole time was, 24 hours a day. Or is he talking about ongoing point action sins that are not repented of, that you continue to do, you don't have any intention of stopping, you're still going to murder, you're still going to rob banks? That's ongoing lifestyle. That's living and walking in darkness.
Right.
That's adultery. That's a person who marries somebody that they're not supposed to be married to and having sexual relations that they're not supposed to have. Point actions, and yet living in that condition.
Yeah.
Right. So if we're going to define, we're looking at his view. I said whether moikotai is an ongoing sin, we've got to determine it by the context. The immediate context doesn't match his position. The overall biblical context doesn't match his position. Romans 7 and verse 3 contradicts that. Secondly, in Mark chapter 6 and verse 18, we read about Herod. John the Baptist told Herod, you have your brother Philip's wife. In fact, the verse says, because John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Herodias was still Philip's wife. It wasn't the fact that Philip and Herodias got a divorce and now she has married Herod. It's okay now. He would say they divorced, they remarried, that was adultery. Now she can continue in that second marriage. But John the Baptist did not endorse that view. John said she is still Philip's wife. This is continuing. The idea is that she is continuing in adultery. Any thoughts or comments about that?
What is the meaning of have her?
Yeah.
And he said it's not lawful for you to have her. Did he mean have a conversation with her?
Right.
Did he mean have her as a traveling companion.
Right.
And that's also a present infinitive.
Interesting.
To have is present infinitive. Yeah.
Let me give you a third passage. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 10 says that if a wife divorces her husband, and it's clear in the context it's not for fornication, that she must remain unmarried. I believe that is speaking in the civil sense. She must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. They got a divorce. It was not for fornication. She does not have a right to remarry. Why? Because he's still her husband. If a woman divorces her husband not for fornication, he continues to be her husband. Remarriage is not an option. Comments about that one?
It's a powerful point.
Okay.
Yes.
Here's a fourth one.
Yeah, I'm just going to, the word's clear enough. You don't need me to.
Okay.
I'll just be quiet.
That's right. 1 Corinthians chapter, Kerry's thrown in some gems here for
That's
us
right,
in some of
he
these
has.
passages. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 1. This is, of course, talking about the problem in Corinth. The man had his father's wife. It's actually reported that there's sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality is not even named amongst the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife. It's very interesting that presumably a divorce had taken place, and now the man has married his father's wife, but he's identified here as his father's wife. The point that I'm making as we go through these passages is that if you look at the overall context of the Bible defining adultery, it matches with the traditional view in the Church of Christ, and that is exactly what the text says. If a man puts away his wife not for fornication and marries another, he is continuing in adultery, and he that marrieth her that is put away commits adultery. She continues in adultery, and we see numerous biblical examples. The overall biblical context supports that. So there's a lot of smoke about the grammar, but the biblical context supports the traditional view, which is exactly what the text says.
Well, I'm smiling again, and you know what I'm going to say.
Okay.
That is also a present infinitive. So the rule, according to the video, is when you have a present infinitive, that's what? It
Ongoing.
must be ongoing action. And here it is ongoing action. Now, here's the interesting thing to me, Don, that I saw Aaron and Dave, I don't know, several years ago. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't studying about divorce and remarriage. I stumbled across this, and I said, how did I miss this for 30 years? You have him saying, and set aside the issue of divorce and remarriage. Let's just forget about the questions about the father's wife, and that relationship. Let's just look at the grammar part of it here. To have his father's wife is fornication. It's sin, right? It's ongoing. It's present. All right. Look at verse 2. And you are puffed up and have not rather mourned that he who has done this deed might be taken away from among you. The one who has done or practiced this deed is an aorist.
Aorist.
It refers to the past here. And the word deed is singular, not plural. Deed. So let's use hypothetically the reasoning. If the Bible had wanted to say that something was a one-time act and it's in the past, it looks like maybe this would be the way to say it.
Kept on committing those deeds.
Committing those deeds. But it says he who has done this deed, and he uses that language to describe what that man was presently doing.
Yes. Like Dave said, it's the way you live or walk. Yeah. That's
this is simple. This to me is more powerful than 15 grammatical quotations.
It really is. I believe that the grammar here is a lot of smoke. There are two things that Mike has to do to reach his position. The first one is he has to remove adultery from being a continuing action.
Yes.
We got a lot of smoke in the grammar. The context, in the immediate context, says he's wrong about that. The overall Bible context says he's wrong about that. But a second thing he has to do in order to accomplish his position is he has to redefine the meaning of adultery.
Yes.
I think this is where the rubber really meets the road.
Yes.
He defines adultery as putting away one's wife and marrying another. I searched. I can't find a place in the Bible where adultery is defined that way. So if we're going to look contextually at the meaning of adultery, how is adultery defined? What is adultery?
Yes, good question. I did that years ago myself, Don, the same thing that you've done. I looked at every usage in the King James Version of fornication and adultery in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And what I found is that you have a figurative or a, quote, spiritual use where God's people are committing spiritual adultery or fornication, and you have the physical, literal sense. Now, Hugo McCord brought out that there's a third sense in your paper, and I appreciate you're putting it in there, that he would say a third sense would be the mental adultery of Matthew 5, verse 27. That's a good point. But I've never seen in all those examples a case of a point action, one-time instance of adultery in any of those senses. In other words, if it's spiritual adultery, in all those cases in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's not just that you're married to a foreign god, it's that you're serving that foreign god. And in physical adultery, outside of marriage, it's not just the one-time act, it's the ongoing, it's every time you have sex. In the New Testament, when it describes marriage, you have the same idea involved. And if I could just interject a few passages here in conjunction with this.
Sure, please.
In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 9, the whole issue is, in order to define the word adultery, you have to get back to the word marry, because this is what the speaker here is saying. It's what I heard in the 80s. It's what we heard back in the late 70s, early 80s, throughout the 80s, that the adultery occurs at the time of the marriage, that second marriage. That means the marriage ceremony is adultery. I just wrote those words down and I looked at it, and these are quotations from the video. Adultery is not sex. Let me just listen to that. Just think about the entire context and usage in the whole Bible. And what he does not say, he keeps saying that the adultery is point action, but what he means by that is the marriage ceremony is adultery.
Right.
Now, if he'd said that, I think that would have thrown up a lot more indications to people that this is a little bit different here, to say the very least. And so that's what he means. But here's really a death nail to what he's saying. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 9, we've already referred to this. It is better to marry than to burn with passion. So he's saying to the widows and the unmarried, if you can't control, then let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn, that is, to burn with lust and to burn with passion. So what is the opposite of burning with passion? It's not just going through the ceremony. What is it?
It's marrying and committing the sexual act, yeah.
It's marrying, committing the sexual act. It's having sex in marriage. Yeah. And yet, he doesn't use the word sex here. He doesn't use the word coite. He doesn't say marry and then lie with her. You see, if you break it down, what this video is arguing is that because Jesus says if you divorce unscripturally and then you marry another, you commit adultery. Because Jesus didn't say something like marry and then lie with her, or marry and then go to bed with her, that therefore marriage, the word marry there, only refers to the marriage ceremony. That is just a complete misunderstanding of the interpretation of the New Testament. This is an inclusive word here. Now, that's what I'm saying is found here in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 9. When he says it is better to marry, he's including sex in that because of the comparison.
And I wonder if that's sometimes our 2025 culture imposing our culture's, the traditions we have in our culture back onto the, we say marry, we think, oh, that's the marriage, but then the sex is completely different. When you look at the Bible, they're saying this is a part, the reason that you're burning. If you're burning with passion, what's the reason for marrying? Because the reason you're burning is you have these sexual desires that need to be fulfilled.
That's right.
Well, if we're going to read Matthew 19:9, if a man divorces his wife except it be for fornication and marries another, he commits adultery. And we want to ask, what is adultery? There's two senses, spiritual or literal physical adultery. in hermeneutics, the Bible science of interpretation,
Yes.
words are to be interpreted in the literal sense unless the context would indicate otherwise.
Yes.
So I made a couple of notes here. In Matthew 19:9, the context is a literal marriage.
Yes.
The husband is a literal man.
Mm-hmm.
The wife is a literal woman. The divorce is a literal divorce. The fornication is literal, sexual fornication. And yet the adultery, we're going to say, is spiritual.
Doesn't make sense.
It doesn't fit the context at all.
It does not. If I could go to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14 again, just as another case here, and then I'll try to wrap this up. I know everybody is anxious to say some other things about this. On this same point, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14, therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. By the way, I'm on a roll here, so I might as well go ahead and ask the question. Can you guess what all those infinitives are? They're all present. But notice how they're used differently. I will therefore that the younger widows marry. Well, that's not ongoing. That's
Not continue to marry.
bear
polygamy.
children. Depends on how many they want to have.
Yeah.
Manage the house. That's ongoing. So it varies.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is this. How does she have children?
Yeah.
Sex.
Yeah.
Well, where is that in the passage?
Implied in the word
It's implied.
marriage.
It is implied in the word marry. So if sex is implied in the word marry in 1 Timothy 5:14, if sex is implied in Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 9, it is better to marry than to burn, then why on earth would anybody have any trouble seeing that when Jesus said, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, that he's including the sex act?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That just doesn't make sense to me.
Sure.
It's just, again, you could label it in different ways, but when we talk about living with somebody today, when we talk about, when the Bible talks about Adam knowing his wife, when the Bible talks about someone lying with someone, when we talk today about someone sleeping with someone, when we talk about someone going to bed with someone, if we understand that and use common sense there,
Sure.
it shouldn't be hard with this word marry.
Dave, you look like you've been wanting to say something.
Well, it just dawned on me just thinking through all this stuff. John chapter 8, which is a textual variant, but here's this woman, right? And she's caught. The text says
In the very
in
act.
adultery in the very act. So now we know, fellas. She was at the divorce court trying to divorce her husband. And then she was caught in a remarriage ceremony.
That would be the implication. I wonder what I guess he probably wouldn't apply it to that passage.
But I know what you're saying. I mean, it's like I keep thinking of, your list of what you said with Herod, and then also have. The passage we looked at after that, I can't remember which one it was, but have all these terms that we use maybe to sort of be more cultured, lie with her or live with her, as opposed to saying commit the sexual act.
Right.
Why is it any different when Matthew 19
Exactly.
does the exact same thing we do?
Yeah.
Well, to summarize this, I would say this. In order to achieve Mike's position, number one, you have to prove that moikatai is a one-time action, which the grammar doesn't prove, the context doesn't prove. In fact, I believe that we have illustrated that the immediate context proves the opposite. The overall biblical context proves the opposite. Secondly, he has to redefine adultery, and it contradicts the hermeneutics of this passage, and it doesn't fit. But that's the two hurdles he has to get through, and I think that we have answered those very clearly. Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the avenue that you give at GBN to talk openly about these things. I appreciate it.
And we certainly mean no ill will toward anyone. But as you started the program, this is very, very serious.
Yes.
And I'll grant you when someone says, well, you're doctor and you're responsible for breaking up people that could have had a life together. Okay, I understand that. That's been required many times in history. For example, Moses was nurtured, the text says, by his mother. You want to talk about deep psychological roots over a period of 40 years, his family in Egypt, all that entailed. You don't think that was unbelievable, decapitate or severing, like an amputation, for him to walk away from that? But God required it.
That's right.
That's right.
And which would you rather be in the situation of being, of urging people to stick with the rigidity and the strictness of the Bible, even if it means foregoing companionship, pleasure, and so forth? On the other hand, if you take the other position, you will be held responsible for urging people to live in adultery.
That's right.
And the teachers are going to give stricter account, according to James.
That's
To
right.
me, those are very different, and one of them is preferable to the other.
That's right.
The other thing I've talked, before with my wife about, we have little children, 4 little children. And I think about, when you become a parent, you realize your life is not about you anymore. And anyone that has children can understand that. I remember my dad telling me all these things you do, you think are fun, wait till you have kids. And now that I have kids, I think about, my job as a parent. My life is not necessarily about me anymore. It's about what do I need to do to provide a great nurturing environment for the children. And I can't presume to know why God did things, but from what I see in the scriptures, God made marriage so rigid. Number one, if you could just essentially divorce and say you're sorry for any reason and move on, how many broken homes would that leave for children?
That's right.
That's right. I would hypothetically forego sex for the rest of my life to make sure that my children have a happy home so that they can go to heaven. Mm-hmm. And I think that what you guys mentioned, I was born in 84, but the more I learn about American history, I see the 60s and the 70s, this idea of you need to do whatever makes you feel good. And I think that's what drives a lot of adults. And it's almost like when you talk to somebody, and I know everyone has. I know Mike has studied with people in this situation before when he held the position that we hold now. So I know he can relate. Everyone can relate that's had to sit down with a couple and explain to them, you think they're in an unscriptural marriage. And some of them respond humbly, and some of them respond with the vitriol of, how dare you? How dare you tell me that I can't sleep with whoever I want to for the rest of my life? Mm-hmm. And when you think about, look, if you're trying to do what God wants to do to provide a safe household for those children, I'm thankful that God's law is so rigid. There's a lot of people who probably, when they didn't like each other, thought about divorcing and remarrying, even in the Lord's church, but then they realized, no, God made this very specific for this one reason. I'm going to honor this. And I think about how many more broken homes there would have been had we not held to God's strict rigidity. I just think of that when I think about children.
I think that's a great point. If that curb or restraint of Matthew 19:9 and Matthew 5:32 were not in the Bible, think about how much worse it would be. That's a great point, Aaron.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for being here. We love and respect you, and it took a good deal of effort for you to be here, and we're thankful for it. I want to end on this note. Jesus said, if a man puts away his wife, except it be for fornication, and he marries another, he commits adultery. The disciples are shocked by this, and they said, Lord, if this is the case, maybe it's better not to marry. And Jesus responded and said, all cannot accept this saying. Now listen what he says in verse 12. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. That is, when the disciples responded in shock, Lord, this is extremely strict. Maybe it's better not to get married. He said, not everyone can choose to go that route or choose not to marry. He says, but there are some who were born that way. They can't engage in the sexual intimacies of marriage. And then he says some were, they had it thrust upon them, like eunuchs in the Bible, like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then he says there are some who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. I think we're talking about people in this category. Some people, they realize that they do not have a scriptural right to remarry, and so because of that, they make themselves eunuchs. That is, they refrain from marriage, they refrain from the sexual intimacies because they want to go to heaven. And that's what we're talking about in this program. Any final thoughts?
The last thing, do you remember a story that you told in a sermon a long time ago? I just looked at Matthew 19:10 and had it written in my Bible. about. I have Dawn's story about a man sobbing.
Yeah.
Do you remember that story? Would you mind telling that? Is that
Sure. This was a situation where I had gone into a new work. There was a man and his wife who were elderly, and I was told that they were in an unscriptural marriage, but I was brand new, and I thought, we've got elders. I'm not going to go and pry into this. I'd been there not very long, and the man's wife passed away. And afterwards, he called me, and he asked if I could come to his house to visit. And he sobbed just uncontrollably. The man was probably in his 80s or 90s, and he just sobbed uncontrollably. And he said, I let my wife die in adultery because I did not want to end my marriage. And it haunted him for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I've talked to my wife about, of course, we did our research before we got married, but I've always said if I found out that I was in an unscriptural marriage with her, I said I will build myself a tiny house on the back corner of the property, and I will work and I will pay for everything you and my kids ever need, but I want you to go to heaven. And if someone loves their wife enough to want them to go to heaven,
Right.
I mean,
Sacrifice.
yeah, think about Daniel. Daniel was made a eunuch at a young
That's right.
age. He didn't make excuses. And I'm just saying, if you want your wife to go to heaven, if you want your kids to go to heaven, you know.
I had a good friend that was probably 30 years older than I am, a good Christian woman. Little, quiet Christian woman, but the best personal worker I've ever seen in my life. Hands down. Personal evangelism, she had it. She could do it. She was studying with a man one time on this very issue, and he hadn't married this woman yet. They were just living together. And she told him that he was wrong. She showed him that he was in sin. And he said, well, I just love her too much to tell her that. Yeah. And here's what my friend told him. She said in her own just gentle little way, she said, no, you don't love her enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we've all had experiences, but think of the congregations all across our brotherhood that have adulterous couples. And the elders know it, but they will not confront the situation.
Yeah. Yes.
So don't tell me that they love the sheep.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And they're going to give an account for their souls.
That's right.
Well, we've been talking about some very serious and sobering things today. Maybe you have some questions about them and you'd like to reach out to us at the Gospel Broadcasting Network. If we can help, we would love to do that. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Answering the Error.